In the spring of 1875, a man no one recognized appeared at the Forsyth trading post in Taney County, Missouri, and laid 3 hides on the counter. The trading post owner was a man named Gideon Farr. He had been buying and selling pelts in the Ozarks for 22 years. He had handled the hides of every animal native to the region: beaver, mink, otter, fox, deer, bear, mountain lion, in the years before they had become scarce. He knew pelts the way a man knows his own handwriting. He knew the weight of them, the texture, the particular smell of different species, cured in different ways by different trappers using different methods. He could identify an animal from its hide the way a doctor identifies a patient from their chart. Quickly, without hesitation, from accumulated experience that had long since become instinct. He looked at the 3 hides on his counter for a long time without speaking. They were large, larger than bear, and bear was the largest pelt he regularly handled. The fur was wrong. Not wrong in the sense of poor quality or improper curing, but wrong in the sense of not corresponding to any animal he had seen or handled or heard described. The individual hairs were too long and too coarse, and had a quality of color that he struggled to name afterward. Not brown, not black, not any of the standard descriptions he used for animal fur. He said, when he described this to a subsequent buyer some weeks later, that the color was the color of something that had never been in sunlight. He said this, and then stopped, because the description did not satisfy him, and he could see that it did not communicate what he meant, and he did not have better language. The shape of the hides was wrong too. Not in any specific way he could point to, but in the accumulated way of a thing that doesn't resolve into familiarity, no matter how long you look at it. He had been looking at animal hides for 22 years, and he had never looked at one and felt, as he felt looking at these 3, that the animal it had come from was not an animal he had a category for. The smell was the 3rd thing. The hides were properly cured. He could tell this. The curing process had been done with skill and thoroughness, and the dominant smell was the smell of well-cured leather, which is a specific and familiar smell that he had no difficulty identifying. But underneath that smell, mixed into it in a way that the curing had not entirely suppressed, was something else. He could not name it. He described it later as the smell of somewhere underground, but deeper underground than any mine he had been in, and colder and more enclosed. The man who had laid the hides on the counter was watching him. He was old, or appeared old, the kind of age that outdoor life in the Ozarks produces in men who have spent decades in the elements, which compresses the apparent years in a way that makes precise estimation difficult. He could have been 55 or 75. His face was weathered to a texture that the sun and the wind and the cold had worked on for a long time. His eyes were a pale color, gray or light blue. Farr was not certain afterward, and they were watching Farr with an attention that was complete and still, and that had in it no impatience, no anxiety, no particular expression at all, just watching. He had not introduced himself. He had come in, laid the hides on the counter, and stood waiting. Farr asked, "What animal?" The man said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Mountain animal." He said it the way a man says a thing he has said many times and that he considers sufficient, though the person he is saying it to clearly does not find it sufficient. Farr said, "I've been buying mountain animals for 22 years. These aren't mountain animals I know." The man said, "They're mountain animals I know." This was the entirety of the conversation about the origin of the hides. Farr asked the price. The man named a price that was high but not outrageous for pelts of this size and apparent quality, if quality was the right word. If quality applied to something this unfamiliar, Farr paid it. He paid it because the hides were real, and they were large, and whatever they were, they had value, and because something in the transaction, something in the stillness of the man across the counter, and the completeness of his watching, made Farr feel that negotiating was not something this transaction was going to accommodate. The man took the money in silver. He had specified silver, and left. Farr stood behind his counter with 3 hides that he could not identify, and a feeling that he could not entirely account for, which was the feeling of a man who has handled an object that was not meant for him to handle, without knowing what the object was, or why the handling of it was inappropriate. He sold 2 of the hides to a buyer from Springfield who came through the following month. The buyer examined them with the same extended silence that Farr had, asked the same question about origin, received the same insufficient answer, and bought them anyway for the same reason. They were real, they were large, and unfamiliarity was not the same as worthlessness. What became of those 2 hides is not known. The 3rd hide Farr kept. He kept it in the back room of the trading post, wrapped in canvas, for the better part of a year. He kept it because he could not stop thinking about it, in the way that you cannot stop thinking about something that has not resolved itself into any category you possess. Periodically, he would go to the back room and unwrap it and look at it again, hoping that a subsequent viewing would produce the recognition that the first had not. It never did. The hide remained exactly what it had been on the first day, something he could not identify and could not stop trying to identify. He eventually sold it in the winter of 1875 to a man passing through who claimed to be a collector of natural curiosities and who paid more than the hide was worth as a pelt for the privilege of owning something he also could not identify. Farr took the money and was glad to be rid of the thing, and then spent the following months feeling the absence of it in a way he would not have predicted and could not explain. The man who had brought the hides, he had not given a name on the first visit, came back in the spring of 1876. He brought 4 hides this time. They were larger than the 3 from the previous year. He also, on this second visit, gave Farr a name to put in the ledger. He said, "You can call me Vess." He said it the way a person offers the minimum necessary information and no more. Farr put it in the ledger. He put it next to the entry for the previous year's transaction, which he had recorded as unknown trapper, 3 hides, unidentified species. He crossed out unknown trapper and wrote Vess. He did not write Old Vess. That designation came from the community, from the people who heard about the transactions and who, in the way of Ozark communities, needed a distinguishing label for a person they could not otherwise place, and who chose old because the man appeared old, regardless of whether old was accurate. The 4 hides from the spring of 1876 were larger than the 3 from 1875, and they were different in a way that Farr noticed and noted in his private journal, but did not discuss with buyers. The color was slightly different. The texture was slightly different. He wrote, "As if they are not from the same animal, but they share the quality of wrongness that the first 3 had. The wrongness is consistent. The details within it vary." He sold all 4. He wrote down the names of the buyers, which he had not done for the first transaction. He wrote, "In case someone asks." He was not sure who he thought might ask, or what he thought they might want to know. He wrote it anyway. In the spring of 1877, Vess came back with 5 hides. By this time, Farr had told enough people about the transactions that there was a small gathering at the trading post on the morning Vess arrived. 6 or 7 people who had heard about the unusual hides and had come to see them. Vess laid the 5 hides on the counter, named his price in the same flat way, and stood watching while Farr examined them, and the gathered observers observed. The observers' reactions were consistent with Farr's original reaction. Extended silence, attempts at identification that produced no identification, and a quality of discomfort that most of them did not articulate directly, but that was visible in the way they stood. Slightly back from the counter, not touching the hides, maintaining a distance that the size and quality of the pelts did not rationally require. Farr noticed, watching the gathered observers watch the hides, that not one of them reached out to touch the pelts. This was unusual. Farmers and tradespeople in the Ozarks examined goods by handling them, by feeling the weight, the texture, the quality of workmanship. Standing back from merchandise without touching it was not their habit. And yet no one in that gathering touched the hides. They looked. They kept their distance. And after a few minutes, one by one, they found reasons to leave. None of them asked Farr later what had become of the hides. None of them mentioned the hides in conversation with him. It was as though the morning at the trading post had been quietly set aside, filed in the place where you file things that you cannot account for and have decided not to try. One of the observers was a man named Apprentice Clay, who had been a veterinarian in Taney County for 15 years and who had professional experience with the anatomy of animals that most of the other observers lacked. He examined the hides more closely than the others and spent considerably longer doing so. Then he said, to Farr, rather than to Vess, and in a voice that was carefully controlled, in the way of a professional maintaining professional composure, the musculature pattern indicated by these hides is not consistent with any quadruped I have knowledge of. He said, the attachment points for the major muscle groups are in the wrong locations. He said, I don't know what this animal looked like when it was alive. I know it didn't look like anything I've seen. Vess was watching Clay during this assessment. Farr noticed this and noted it later. Vess watched Clay speak with the same complete stillness he brought to everything. And at the end of Clay's assessment, he looked at Farr and said, same price as before. Farr paid the same price as before. Vess left. Clay stayed for another hour, examining the hides with increasing agitation that he continued to contain professionally. He came back the following day and examined them again. He came back a third time the day after that. On the third visit, he asked Farr whether he could take one of the hides to study more thoroughly, and Farr, who had not sold any of them yet, and who was by this point curious about what Clay might find, agreed. Clay had the hide for 3 weeks. During those 3 weeks, Farr later learned, Clay had conducted an examination that went well beyond what he had been able to do at the trading post counter. He had measured every dimension of the hide. He had examined the hair structure under a magnifying glass and then under a microscope that he borrowed from the county doctor. He had consulted 3 books on comparative anatomy that he had in his personal collection, and then written to a colleague in Springfield, requesting 2 more. He had sketched the hide in detail from multiple angles and had attempted to reconstruct, from the evidence of the hide's shape and the positions of various structural features, what the living animal might have looked like. He had burned this reconstruction before bringing the hide back to Farr. He told Farr this directly, that he had made the reconstruction and destroyed it, without explaining why. When he brought the hide back, he was quieter than Farr had seen him in 15 years of acquaintance. He put the hide on the counter and stood there for a moment, without speaking. Then he said, "I wrote to a professor at Washington University in St. Louis who studies comparative anatomy. I described what I found. I didn't send the hide because I wasn't sure I wanted to part with it." He said, the professor wrote back. He said he couldn't account for what I described from any known species. He said he was interested in seeing the hide. Farr said, "What did you find?" Clay said, "The hide is from a mammal. The hair structure is mammalian. The skin structure is mammalian. Beyond that, I don't know. The morphology, the shape of the thing, the proportions, doesn't correspond to any mammal I know, and I know most of the mammals." He paused. He said, "I measured the hide. If the animal was proportioned the way mammals typically are, which I acknowledge may not be the correct assumption, then I'm looking at something that was approximately 9 feet long and weighed, I would estimate, somewhere between 400 and 600 pounds. He said, "There is no mammal in the Missouri Ozarks that is 9 feet long and weighs 400 to 600 pounds. Farr said, "There wasn't before." Clay looked at him. He said, "No, not before." He said one more thing before he left. He said it quietly, in the manner of a man speaking something he had decided to say, and then almost decided not to say, and had ultimately said because the alternative was to carry it alone. He said, "Whatever this animal was, it was not young when it died. The hide shows markers of age, not disease, not injury, just age, that suggest it lived for a very long time." He said, "I don't know how to quantify that. I don't have a baseline for this species, but the indicators of age in the hide are more pronounced than I would expect in any mammal under 20 or 30 years old. And several of the structural features are consistent with what I would expect in something considerably older than that." He said, "I don't know what to do with this information." He said, "I'm telling you because I think you should have it, not because I think it changes anything." He left. Farr sold the remaining 4 hides over the following 2 months to buyers who came specifically because word had gotten around about the unusual pelts and who paid above the standard price for the privilege of owning something inexplicable. He kept the names of all of them. In the spring of 1878, Vess did not come in April. He did not come in May. Farr, who had built up enough of a pattern from 3 consecutive springs to have a reasonable expectation, noted the absence and wondered about it in the way you wonder about a person you have no connection to, and no way of contacting, and no reason to worry about, but whom you are, nonetheless, wondering about. Vess came in June. He was later than he had been in the previous 3 years, and he was carrying something different. He was not carrying hides. He was carrying a crate. The crate was approximately 3 feet long and 18 inches wide and 18 inches deep. It was made from pine boards, well constructed, with the boards fitted tightly and the seams sealed with something that Farr could not identify, but that looked like it had been applied carefully and with a specific purpose. The crate had no handle and no hinge and no visible means of opening it. The boards were nailed shut in a pattern that covered the entire surface. More nails than a crate of this size required for structural integrity. Significantly more, the nails placed as though the intention was not structural, but preventive. As though the nailing was meant not to hold the crate together, but to ensure that it stayed closed. Vess set the crate on the counter. The smell was immediate. Not the smell of the hides. That smell had been present, but manageable. Something the nostrils adjusted to over time, the way they adjust to any strong but consistent odor. This smell was different. It was the same element that had been present underneath the curing smell of the hides, but without the curing smell to mediate it. It was the smell of somewhere underground, deep and cold and enclosed, and it was strong enough that Farr stepped back from the counter involuntarily before he knew he was stepping back. The two horses tied outside the trading post, Farr heard them through the open door, began to react within seconds of the crate being set on the counter. Not simply shifting or stamping, which horses do when mildly disturbed, but the particular vocalization and movement of horses that are genuinely frightened, which is a different quality of reaction entirely, and which Farr recognized immediately from 22 years of life in a working environment that included horses. Farr said, "What is that?" Vess said, "Something I found." Farr said, "What did you find?" Vess said, "Something that was where it shouldn't have been." He said this with the particular flatness of a man who has spent considerable time thinking about how to phrase something, and has settled on phrasing that is accurate enough and does not say more than he intends to say. Farr said, "I can't buy that." Vess said, "I'm not selling it. I need you to send it somewhere." This was the longest conversation Farr had ever had with Vess. It was not a long conversation. He said, "Send it where?" Vess said, "St. Louis, the university." He reached into his coat and produced a piece of paper on which an address was written. The address of the Department of Natural Sciences at Washington University in St. Louis. In a handwriting that Farr would later describe as surprisingly careful for a man who otherwise presented as someone for whom writing was not a primary activity. He put the paper on the counter beside the crate. Farr looked at the paper. He looked at the crate. He could hear the horses outside, still distressed, their sounds becoming more urgent. He said, "What's in it?" Vess looked at him for a moment with that complete and attending stillness and said, "Something the university will want to see." He paid for the shipping in advance, in silver. He named a figure that was more than twice the actual shipping cost. The excess presented without explanation. Then he walked out of the trading post, and Farr never saw him again. Farr wrapped the crate in canvas that afternoon. He wrapped it thoroughly, several layers, tied tightly. He did this because the smell was becoming an issue. The two horses had been joined by a dog that had come from somewhere down the road, and the dog was behaving in a way that Farr found deeply uncomfortable, circling the trading post at a distance of approximately 30 yards, and refusing to come closer, and refusing to leave, which was the behavior of an animal that has perceived a threat and cannot determine its location or nature, and is therefore unable to respond to it in any productive way. He arranged for the crate to be picked up by the freight wagon that ran between Forsyth and the railhead at Springfield the following morning. He spent the night in the trading post. He had not planned to. His house was a quarter-mile away, but after the freight arrangements were made, he found he did not want to be in the building with the crate any longer than necessary, and he also found, when he tried to go home for the evening, that he did not want to leave the crate unattended. He sat with it through the night. He did not sleep. He wrote in his journal. He wrote, "I have been in business for 22 years, and I have never refused to be in the same room with merchandise. I am refusing now, and I am here anyway, and I cannot fully account for either response." He wrote, "The smell is less with the canvas wrapping, but it is not gone." He wrote, "I keep thinking about Apprentice Clay's estimate. 9 feet, 400 to 600 pounds. And then I think about what Vess brought in today, which is not a hide, and is therefore not what was left after the thing was dead." He wrote, "I think about what Vess said. Something that was where it shouldn't have been. he wrote. "I think about where that would be." The freight wagon came in the morning. The driver loaded the crate without comment, because he loaded crates without comment, as a matter of professional practice. He drove to Springfield. The crate went on to the train. The train went to St. Louis. Washington University in St. Louis received the crate on June 23, 1878. It was logged in the Department of Natural Sciences Incoming Materials Registry with the following entry: one wooden crate, sealed. Origin Forsyth, Missouri via freight and rail. Sender identified as Vess, no surname. Contents described as natural specimen. Condition of exterior good. Smell noted. The log entry is the last official record of the crate's existence in the university's archives. The professor, who had corresponded with Apprentice Clay about the hides, was a man named Edmund Hatch. He was 47 years old in 1878, a specialist in vertebrate anatomy who had published extensively on the comparative morphology of North American mammals. He was, by any professional measure, a serious and accomplished scientist. He was not a man who entertained fanciful interpretations of physical evidence. He was not a man who reached conclusions before the evidence warranted them. He was, in the estimation of his colleagues, one of the most careful and methodical researchers in his department. He received the crate on June 23, 1878. He signed for it himself, which was not standard practice for incoming materials. Typically, a departmental assistant handled receiving, but which suggests he was expecting it and considered its receipt a matter requiring his personal attention. He took the crate to his laboratory. He was alone in the laboratory when he did this. This is documented in the departmental log for that day, which recorded the movements of researchers in and out of the building. The log shows Hatch entering the building at 2 in the afternoon with an assistant, who left at 3. Hatch remained. The log shows him leaving the building at 11:47 in the evening. 9 hours and 47 minutes alone with the crate. His laboratory assistant arrived the following morning at 8 and found the laboratory locked. Hatch arrived at 9:15. The assistant said later, much later, in an account given in 1934 when the assistant was in his 80s, that Hatch's appearance on that morning was altered in a way that the assistant found difficult to describe precisely. He said Hatch looked like a man who had arrived at a conclusion that he was working through the implications of, and that the working through was taking more of him than conclusions usually took. He said Hatch was not disturbed exactly. He said he seemed resolved, like a man who has made a decision. Not a comfortable decision, but a decided one. Hatch told his assistant that the materials received the previous day were being classified under the department's restricted specimen protocol, and that the assistant should not enter the laboratory until further notice. The restricted specimen protocol was a rarely used procedure that allowed department members to handle materials without the standard documentation requirements, on the grounds that some specimens were sensitive enough that public documentation created problems. For the specimen's integrity, for the researcher's ability to work without interference, or for reasons that the protocol did not specify, and that were understood to include cases where the nature of the specimen was not yet established enough to survive the scrutiny of documentation. Hatch invoked this protocol on June 24, 1878. He continued to work in his laboratory, alone, for the following 11 days. On July 5, 1878, he submitted a request to the department head for permission to destroy a specimen under the restricted protocol's destruction provision. The destruction provision allowed for the elimination of a specimen that presented, in the researcher's professional judgment, a risk to the integrity of the department or the institution. The department head approved the request on July 6th. He did this without seeing the specimen. The protocol did not require him to see it. The specimen was destroyed on July 7th, 1878. The log entry for the incoming materials registry, the entry from June 23rd recording the crate's receipt, was removed from the registry at some point between July 1878 and the following year. The pages of the registry for late June 1878 show a gap in the sequential numbering of entries that corresponds precisely to the date of the crate's receipt. The page was not torn out. Someone removed it carefully. Someone who had access to the registry and who understood its numbering system well enough to know that the removal would be detectable if anyone looked for it and cared enough to notice. Edmund Hatch retired from Washington University in 1881, 3 years after the crate's arrival. He was 49 years old, which was young for retirement, and his colleagues noted this with some surprise. He gave no specific reason. He moved to a small town in southern Illinois and lived there quietly for 23 years. He did not publish again after 1878. He had been a prolific publisher before that year. 11 papers in 12 years, 2 books, a reputation as one of the department's most productive researchers. After 1878, nothing. He died in 1904. His papers were donated to the university after his death by his widow, who noted in her accompanying letter that she was donating the papers without having read them herself, because her husband had asked her not to read them, and she had respected this request throughout his life, and intended to continue respecting it after his death. The papers were cataloged and placed in the archive. They remained there, largely unexamined, for the better part of a century. In 1989, a graduate student in the history of science at Washington University came across a reference to Hatch in a footnote and went looking for his papers in the archive. She found them. She spent several weeks reading them. She found, among the papers, a journal that Hatch had kept throughout his professional life. The journal covered the years 1860 through 1881, with regularity and detail. It was, for most of its length, the journal of a careful scientist recording his professional work. The entries for June and July of 1878 were different. They were the only entries in 21 years of journaling that Hatch had written in a hand that the graduate student described as visibly altered, not trembling, not deteriorated, but pressed harder and formed more deliberately than his usual writing, in the way of a person who is concentrating on the act of writing itself as a means of maintaining composure while writing. The entries are also the only entries in the journal that contain passages Hatch subsequently crossed out, not lightly, heavily, with multiple strokes, in a way that made the crossed-out text largely unreadable. The graduate student spent time with the crossed-out passages under various lighting conditions and was able to recover fragments. The fragments taken together did not form coherent sentences. They formed, taken together, the impression of a man writing about something and then deciding repeatedly that what he had written was not something he wanted to exist in written form. What the uncrossed portions of the June and July entries contained was this: June 24th. Received yesterday. Spent the night with it. Have begun the examination. The exterior of the specimen is, here a crossed-out passage. I will confine my notes to what is analytically useful and set aside what is not. June 28th. 4 days of examination. I have established, here, a crossed-out passage. The morphology is, here a crossed-out passage. I have written to 3 colleagues in Europe who have broader exposure to. Here a crossed-out passage. I will not write to anyone. This is not something that benefits from correspondence. July 2nd. I understand now why the hides were as they were. I understand the relationship between what the hides indicated and what the specimen. Here a crossed-out passage. The man who sent this, old Vess. I would like to know where he found it. I would like to know this very much. I would like to know, and I recognize that this wanting is not. Here, a crossed-out passage. July 5th. I have made my decision. The specimen will be destroyed. I have submitted the request. It will be approved because my judgment in these matters has always been trusted, and because no one has seen what I have seen, and therefore no one will question a judgment they cannot evaluate. This is the correct outcome. It is correct because, here, the longest crossed-out passage in the journal, running to approximately a full page. I will say only that it is correct and leave the reasoning in the crossing out where it belongs. July 7th. Done. After July 7th, the journal continues for another 3 years, through Hatch's retirement in 1881. The entries return to their normal character: careful, detailed, professionally descriptive. They contain no further reference to Vess, the crate, or what was in it. The last entry in the journal, written on the day of Hatch's retirement, is a single line. He wrote, "I have done what I could with what I was given, and I have decided that this is sufficient." He closed the journal. He did not open it again. He moved to Southern Illinois. He did not publish again. He lived quietly for 23 years with his wife, who did not read his papers, and he died in a manner his neighbors described as peaceful, in the manner of a man who had resolved something and was at peace with the resolution. The graduate student published a paper in 1991 about Hatch's career, focusing on the period before 1878. She included a brief section on the 1878 period that described the cessation of publication and the retirement without providing the content of the journal entries, which she described in a footnote as being of uncertain relevance to the professional biography she was constructing. She left Washington University in 1993. She did not finish her doctorate. The journal is in the archive. The graduate student's notes are not. What old Vess traded at the Forsyth Post between 1875 and 1878 has never been formally identified. This is not for lack of trying. The hides that Gideon Farr sold to various buyers in those years passed through several hands before disappearing from the traceable record, and several of the buyers made efforts, some serious, some casual, to determine what animal had produced them. The veterinarian Apprentice Clay's effort was the most sustained of the local ones. The Professor Edmund Hatch's effort was the most professionally equipped. Neither produced a public conclusion. What they produced, instead, were absences. The log entry removed from the university's materials registry. The crossed-out passages in Hatch's journal. The graduate student who left without finishing her degree. The decision not to publish, extended over decades and across multiple people who came into contact with the material and made, each of them, in their own way and for their own reasons, the same decision. The pattern of the absences is the thing that subsequent researchers have found most significant. Not any single absence, each one, taken alone, is explainable by ordinary circumstances. Log pages get damaged and removed. Researchers cross out passages they later consider poorly expressed. Students leave graduate programs for reasons that have nothing to do with their research. Scientists retire early. Taken together, these absences form a shape. The shape is the shape of a thing that, when people encounter it, they consistently decide is not something they want in the written record. The people who made this decision were, without exception, precise and careful people. Farr, who ran a trading post for 22 years and kept meticulous records of every transaction, did not write down what the hides looked like in his business ledger, only in his private journal. Clay, a veterinarian with 15 years of professional experience and a scientist's habit of documentation, wrote to a colleague about his findings and then did not follow up. Hatch, one of the most productive researchers in his department, crossed out more words than he left standing in the only journal entries he ever treated this way, and then stopped writing professionally altogether. These were not incurious people. They were not people who avoided difficult material. They were people who, having encountered this specific material, made consistent and deliberate choices about what to put into language and what to leave out of it. The question of what old Vess found, what he was finding over the 3 years of his appearances at the Forsyth post, in whatever part of the Ozark Highlands he was working, is a question that the available record approaches from the outside and never enters. What the available record does contain is this. In the autumn of 1878, several months after Vess's final visit to the trading post, a trapper working the upper reaches of the White River drainage in Taney County came to Farr with an account that Farr recorded in his private journal. The trapper said he had been working a line in the high terrain above the river when he had found sign, tracks primarily, and disturbed ground of the kind that large animals produce when they have been moving through an area with some regularity. The tracks were large. He described them in terms that matched as closely as Farr could determine what the hides suggested about the size of the animal that had produced them. The trapper had followed the tracks for approximately a mile before they led him to a place he described as a hole in the ridge. Not a cave, he said. He had been in caves, and this was not a cave. A cave opens horizontally into a hillside or vertically from the surface. This was a hole, approximately 4 feet in diameter, vertical, going straight down. He had looked into it and could not see the bottom. He said the smell coming from the hole was something he could not describe in ordinary terms. He said it was the smell of a place that was very deep and very cold, and that had things in it that had been in it for a very long time. He said he had heard something from the hole. Not clearly, not something he could identify or describe with any precision. A sound from some depth below the surface. He said, it was the kind of sound you hear, and then look around to see if anyone else heard it, but there is no one else. He had not gone down the hole. He had no means to do so, and no desire to. He had backed away from it, and returned to his line, and had not gone back to that part of the ridge. He had come to Farr because he had heard about the unusual hides, and the man who had brought them, and because he thought Farr might know something that would help him account for what he had found. Farr did not know what would help him account for it. He wrote in his journal, I could not tell him what I know, which is almost nothing, and what little of it I know would not comfort him. He wrote, the hole in the ridge, the smell, the sound. He wrote, I think about Vess, who has not come back since June, and I think about where a man goes when he has found a hole in a ridge that goes deeper than he can see, and has been going into that hole and coming out with things to trade. He wrote, I think about whether he is still going in. He wrote, I think about what Hatch decided to do with the last thing. He wrote, I think about why Hatch decided that. He wrote, I do not write what I think the answer is to that last question. I leave it here as a question, which is where I intend it to stay. The trapper went back to his line. He did not, as Farr knew, return to the place where the hole was. Farr did not know his name. He had not asked, and the trapper had not given it, and the entry in the journal records him only as a trapper from the upper White River country. Farr kept the trading post for another 11 years, until his death in 1889. Vess did not appear again in those 11 years. No further unusual hides were brought in by Vess or anyone else. The hole in the ridge, wherever it was not reported to Farr again. Farr's journal passed to his son, who kept it, and then to his grandson, who donated it to the Taney County Historical Society in 1942. The Historical Society cataloged the journal and placed it in their collection. It was examined by a handful of researchers over the following decades, primarily people interested in the commercial history of the Ozark trading post system, who read the entries about business transactions and noted, usually without particular emphasis, the entries about the unusual hides and the man named Vess. One researcher read those entries with more than usual emphasis. He was a historian from the University of Missouri who came to the Taney County Historical Society in 1978, exactly 100 years after Vess's last visit to the Forsyth post. He spent 2 days reading Farr's journal. He made extensive notes. He located the buyers' names that Farr had recorded and attempted to trace the hides through subsequent transactions. He found one buyer whose descendants still had family papers, and in those family papers found a brief account of the purchase that matched Farr's account in its essential particulars, and added one detail that Farr's account did not contain. The detail was this: the buyer had measured one of the hides before selling it on and had recorded the measurement in his business papers. The hide measured, at its longest point, 11 feet and 4 inches. The researcher incorporated this into his notes. He did not incorporate it into the book he eventually published, which was a well-regarded history of Ozark trapping that covered the 1820s through the 1880s, and that mentioned the Forsyth trading post in several contexts, but did not mention Vess or the unusual hides at all. When asked about this omission at a talk he gave at the university several years after the book's publication, he said that the Vess material was insufficiently documented to meet the evidentiary standards of the work he was producing. This was accurate, and was also, in the way of accurate statements that do not contain everything true about a situation, incomplete. He retired in 1995. His research files were placed in the university archive. The notes from the Taney County visit are in those files. The measurement, 11 feet and 4 inches, is in the notes. The Ozarks are large. The terrain above the White River drainage in Taney County is steep and heavily wooded, and has not been systematically surveyed in any way that would identify a 4-foot vertical opening in a limestone ridge among the many natural features of that landscape. The United States Geological Survey has maps of the area. The maps show topography. They do not show holes. In the summer of 2008, a group of spelunkers working the karst terrain of Taney County documented 43 cave openings in the upper White River watershed. Of these, 39 were conventional cave entrances, horizontal or near horizontal openings into the limestone hillsides. 4 were vertical shafts, dropping straight down into the limestone. The 4 vertical shafts were explored to the extent that the explorers' equipment permitted. 3 of them bottomed out at depths between 40 and 90 feet, and connected to lateral passages that the explorers mapped and documented in the standard way. The 4th did not bottom out. The explorers dropped a weighted line to 250 feet. The weight did not hit bottom. They did not have sufficient rope to continue. The shaft was approximately 4 feet in diameter at the surface, consistent with what the trapper had described to Farr in 1878, and appeared, at the depth their lights could illuminate, to be consistent in diameter as it descended. The group photographed the shaft opening extensively. The photographs show a circular opening in limestone, smooth-edged in the way of openings that have had water moving through them over geological time, with the darkness below resolving into complete darkness within approximately 8 feet of the surface. One of the photographs, taken with a long exposure setting in an attempt to capture more detail at depth, shows nothing below the 8-foot mark except darkness. The photographer noted in the expedition log that she had the sensation, while looking through the viewfinder at the shaft below, that the darkness was not empty. She noted this as a subjective impression and flagged it as such in the standard way that exploration logs acknowledge the psychological effects of confined dark spaces on the human perceptual system. She also noted the smell. The exploration report noted the shaft as undescended pending return with additional equipment. The group documented the location with GPS coordinates and photographs and filed their report with the Missouri Speleological Survey, which maintains records of cave and shaft exploration in the state. They did not return. The reason given in subsequent communications with the Missouri Speleological Survey was that the group had disbanded following a reorganization of its membership. The survey noted this without particular comment, as exploration groups disband regularly, and undescended shafts are added to the survey's list of sites requiring future attention. One member of the group, not the photographer, another member, who had been standing at the shaft's edge while the line was being lowered, sent an email to the survey approximately 6 months after the expedition. The email is in the survey's administrative records. It asked whether any previous exploration of the shaft had been documented in the survey's database, and whether the survey had any information about the geological features of the surrounding terrain that might account for the shaft's unusual depth. The survey's response, also in the administrative records, noted that no previous exploration of that specific shaft was documented in the survey's database, and that the geological characteristics of the karst terrain in that area of Taney County were consistent with the formation of deep vertical features, though the depth suggested by the failed sounding was toward the extreme end of what was typical for the region. The member who sent the email did not respond to the survey's reply. The shaft remains on the survey's list of sites requiring future attention. It has not been descended. The GPS coordinates are in the Missouri Speleological Survey's database. They are accessible to anyone with an account in the system. No one has returned to descend the shaft. The smell noted in the exploration report, documented because smell is part of the standard reporting protocol for vertical shaft exploration, as certain smells indicate hazardous gas concentrations that require additional equipment, was described as unusual. The report noted that the smell did not correspond to the hydrogen sulfide or carbon dioxide signatures typically associated with deep karst features. It noted that the smell was difficult to categorize, and that none of the 3 explorers present could identify it from their collective experience of approximately 230 cave and shaft explorations. The report noted the smell and moved on, as reports move on from details that cannot be resolved within their standard framework. The smell was the smell of somewhere underground and deep and cold and enclosed, and of things that had been there for a very long time. This is not what the report said. This is what Gideon Farr said in his journal in 1875 about the hides that old Vess laid on his counter on a spring morning in the Missouri Ozarks. The same smell. 133 years apart, old Vess found the shaft in the limestone of the Taney County Highlands. Before that finding, and to understand what it meant that he found it, it helps to understand something about old Vess that the available record contains in fragments rather than directly. The fragments come from Farr's journal, from a brief account given by a Forsyth resident to a county newspaper in 1879, and from a single letter written by Apprentice Clay to a colleague in 1880, 2 years after Vess's last appearance. The Forsyth resident, a woman named Agnes Burkett, who kept a boarding house on the main road and who had seen Vess on his visits to town, described him in the newspaper account in terms that aligned with Farr's description, but added a detail that Farr had not included in his journal. She said that Vess, on the occasions she had seen him in town, moved differently from other men. She said, "Not in any way I can point to specifically. Not limping, not carrying an injury, just differently. Like a man who has spent so much time in terrain that doesn't have level ground that his body has adapted to it and can't quite remember how to move on flat surfaces." She said, like someone who has been underground for a long time and has to remember, when he comes up, how to be above ground. She said this without knowing, at the time she said it, about the shaft. The newspaper account was published in 1879, before the trapper had reported the hole in the ridge to Farr, before the connection between Vess and any specific location had been established. She was describing what she had observed about the way a man moved through a town, and she reached for the description that fit what she saw. And the description she reached for was the description of a man accustomed to being underground. Clay's letter, written to a colleague who specialized in comparative anatomy, is more direct. Clay had been corresponding with this colleague, a man at a university in Ohio, whose name Clay did not include in the letter, and who has not been subsequently identified, about the hide he had examined, and the letter from 1880 was a follow-up to that correspondence. Clay wrote, "I have been thinking further about the age question. You will recall I mentioned that the hide showed markers of age inconsistent with what I would expect in any mammal under 20 to 30 years old, and that several features were consistent with something considerably older. I have been trying to determine what considerably older might mean in this context, and I find that I cannot arrive at a number that satisfies me." He wrote, "The features in question are features that, in the mammals I am familiar with, develop over very long periods and stabilize in a way that allows approximate aging. In this specimen, the features have developed beyond any stable point I can reference." He wrote, "If I were to extrapolate from the mammalian aging models I know, the number I arrive at is not a number I am going to put in this letter." He wrote, "I will say that it is a very large number, and that it is probably not accurate, because the extrapolation assumes the animal ages the way mammals I know age, which may not be a valid assumption." He wrote, "I am telling you this not because I think you can do anything with it, but because I have been carrying it for 3 years, and I find that carrying it alone is becoming difficult." The colleague's response to this letter is not in Clay's papers, which suggests either that it was not preserved or that Clay did not keep it. Clay wrote no further letters on the subject of Vess or the hides. He practiced veterinary medicine in Taney County until his death in 1901. His obituary in the county paper described him as a thorough and careful professional who had served the community faithfully for 37 years. It did not mention the hide or old Vess, or the 3 weeks he had spent examining something that he could not identify, and that he ultimately decided not to write about in full. His papers were dispersed after his death, and most of them have not been located. The letter to the Ohio colleague survived because Clay had kept a draft of it in his personal files, in the way that some people keep drafts of important correspondence. The draft was found by a researcher in 1996 who was going through a collection of miscellaneous papers donated to the Taney County Historical Society and who recognized the significance of the letter from the context of Farr's journal, which the researcher had read the previous year. The researcher did not publish the letter. He wrote about it in a private correspondence with a colleague that has since been found in that colleague's papers. He wrote, "I found something in the Taney County collection that bears on the Vess material. I am not going to publish it. I want to tell you what it contains because I think you should know it exists, and because I find that I want someone else to know it exists. But I am not going to publish it, for reasons that I will not specify in this letter, because specifying them would amount to publishing the information in a different format, and I have decided not to do that." His colleague wrote back asking what the reasons were. He replied, "The reasons are that I read Clay's description of what the age markers in the hide suggested, and I thought about what that meant, and I decided that the thing in that shaft, whatever it is, whatever old Vess found at the bottom of it, has been there for long enough that the question of what it is has probably been answered before by other people in other times. And those people made the same decision that Clay made, and that Hatch made, and that I am making. And that the accumulation of those decisions, across however long the shaft has been there, and whoever has found it before Vess found it, is itself a kind of evidence." He wrote, "The evidence is that every person who has come close enough to know what is in there has decided not to say." He wrote, "I find that I agree with that decision." He wrote, "I am going to go back to my other work now." He did go back to his other work. The letter is in his colleague's papers. The colleague donated the papers to a university archive in 2001. They remain there, cataloged under his name, accessible to researchers. No one has published the Clay letter. No one has published the researcher's correspondence about the Clay letter. The chain of people who have encountered the Vess material and decided not to fully document. It extends from Farr in 1875 to a retired academic in the early 2000s. And at every point in that chain, the decision has been the same decision, made independently, and for reasons that each person found sufficient, but that none of them fully articulated. The shaft is there. The GPS coordinates are in the Missouri Speleological Survey's database. He found it. He went into it by whatever means he had, to whatever depth the shaft permitted, or that he was willing to descend to. How he went into it is a question the record does not answer. A vertical shaft 4 feet in diameter, going past 250 feet requires equipment. Rope, a harness of some kind, a means of illuminating the descent, a means of ascending after the descent. Vess was a trapper. Trappers in the Missouri Ozarks in the 1870s carried the equipment their work required, which was substantial and practical, and did not typically include the equipment of vertical cave exploration, which was a specialized activity practiced by a small community of enthusiasts who had access to the technical knowledge and the materials that made it possible. Farr never asked Vess how he went down the shaft. He asked very few questions of Vess, for reasons he described in his journal as practical. Vess did not answer questions that went beyond the immediate requirements of the transaction. And asking questions he would not answer seemed to Farr to create an imbalance in the transaction that he preferred to avoid. He asked about the animal. He received the minimum answer. He stopped asking. But in his journal, after Vess's final visit in June of 1878, Farr wrote about the question of how. He wrote, "I have been thinking about what it would take to go down a shaft of that kind, and I find that I cannot account for Vess doing it with anything I have ever seen a trapper carry." He wrote, "Which means either he carried equipment I didn't see, or he went down in some other way, or he didn't go down at all and found what he found at the surface. He wrote, "The hides were too large for anything that lives on the surface." He wrote, "The thing in the crate came from somewhere." He wrote, "I think Vess went down." He wrote, "I think he went down in the same way. You go through a territory you know well enough not to need the usual equipment for it. I think he knew that shaft the way I know this store. Every corner, every feature, every place where you step differently because you have learned to step differently." He wrote, "I think he had been going down it for a long time before I ever saw him. And I think that what you find at the bottom of a thing like that, if you go down it enough times, is not just what's there. It is how to be in a place that is not designed for you." He wrote this, and then he stopped writing about Vess entirely. The journal continues for another 11 years, through Farr's death in 1889. Vess does not appear in it again. What old Vess found in the shaft in the limestone of the Taney County Highlands is not known. And he traded those things for silver, and he came back 3 years running. And then in the 4th year, he brought something out that was different. Something that was not a hide. Something that was alive, or had been recently alive, or was in a condition between those two states that the available language did not accommodate. And he had it shipped to a professor in St. Louis who spent 11 days with it alone in his laboratory, and then destroyed it, and retired, and never published again. What old Vess found in the shaft, in the limestone of the Taney County Highlands, is not known. What Edmund Hatch found in the crate is not known. What the crossed-out passages in Hatch's journal said is not fully recoverable. What is in the shaft? What has been in the shaft, for however long it has been there, doing what it does in the deep limestone of the Missouri Ozarks, is not known. The shaft is there. The GPS coordinates are in the Missouri Speleological Survey's database. The smell is there. Whatever made the tracks in the upper White River country in 1878. Whatever old Vess followed into the terrain, whatever left sign that led him to the hole in the ridge, whatever he learned in 3 years of going down and coming back up, with hides that no one could identify, is a question that the shaft has been available to answer for 146 years, and that no one has gone back to ask it. Vess went down. Vess came back up. Then one spring, he came back up with something that he put in a crate and shipped east and did not come back himself. The spring after that, he did not come to the trading post. He did not come the spring after that either. He has not come since. Whatever is in that shaft, whatever old Vess found at the bottom of it, or whatever found old Vess, has been there since before Vess found it, doing what it does in the deep, cold dark of the limestone that underlies the Missouri Ozarks, patient in the way that things are patient when patience is simply their nature, and time is not a constraint they experience the way the people above them experience it. The shaft is 4 feet wide at the surface. It goes down past 250 feet of rope. The horses tied outside the Forsyth trading post panicked 30 yards from a crate that had come from the bottom of it. Edmund Hatch spent 11 days with what was in that crate, and destroyed it, and never wrote again. Old Vess went down and came back up for 3 years, and then he didn't come back up anymore. The Ozarks are large, and steep, and heavily wooded, and the limestone under them goes down farther than anyone has measured. The shaft is in the survey database. The smell from it is still there. And somewhere in the deep, cold dark, below the White River country, in the limestone that has been there since before the Ozarks had a name, in the shaft that goes down past anything a weighted rope has found the bottom of. Something is still there too. It has been there longer than the county above it has existed. It has been there longer than anyone who might give it a name has been alive to name it. It was there when Vess found it. It is there now. The crate was never opened, or so they said.